Thank you, Registrar. Excellencies, panelists, colleagues, students, all of our friends on global live stream everywhere in the world, welcome to the University of the West Indies. The question was asked this morning, did the academic community of UWI recognize that the events of last night would have been what they were? I gave two answers to the three persons who asked that question. One, as an historian, it was entirely predictable and expected. As a humanist, an idealist, it was fearful. And we are all told as academics that we must never allow emotion to triumph over intelligence. And what we saw, a world woke up, three-quarters of humanity woke up this morning in a state of concern and dismay. I would like to begin my comment on this subject by referencing the late, great Bob Marley, when he urged us, in this great future, we must never forget our past. I wish to invite you to a conversation about the evolution in its third phase of plantation America. We are all part in this hemisphere of plantation America. We in the Caribbean are at the center of plantation America. There is North America, there's South America, the Caribbean. This is the journey, another phase in the journey of plantation America. This is the third phase in the sense that we may assume that the first phase was the construction of economies based on racial slavery, native genocide, the rise of white global supremacy as an economic construct. The second phase was the challenge to that construct and that philosophy, which led to civil rights, to independence, to emancipation, to the rise of democracy as a response to that first phase. We are now looking at the beginning in the Western world of a challenge to that second phase. A challenge to the power of democracy, a challenge to the power of inclusive society, a challenge to the concept of multiracialism, multipluralism. It's a challenge to those constructs we have seen in the last 100 years. But we must all understand the fundamental forces of history are real. This is, for everyone, History 101. You may recall that Prime Minister Cameron of Great Britain visited with us in the Caribbean earlier this year and urged us to forget our history and to look to the future. You may recall that 2 weeks ago, the French Prime Minister toured Africa and told the African people to forget their history and look to the future. What is the nature of this future we are being asked to look at and to participate in? It is instructive, I believe, to imagine what is the nature of this future that we're being asked to engage. Critically, it's important for us to understand the contradictory nature of these messages. Because while most of humanity is being asked by the leaders of the Western world to forget their past and look to the future. They themselves are demanding the restoration of their past. And what we saw in that electoral process in the last 24 hours was a reassertion of a kind of past. The primacy of that past over the future that all of us, or the majority of us on this planet, have imagined. Remember, again, the contradictory forces. The United States became the first country in our hemisphere to reject colonization and build a nation. But remember also that the Americans chose to build their independent nation on slavery. That having defeated the British, declared their national independence, declared their sovereignty as a nation, they chose to build their nation on the foundations of slavery. But remember the dialectics of this history, because 100 years later, the Americans went back to the battlefield in the bloodiest civil war in modern history, because slavery and freedom could not live in the same space. Remember also that we in the Caribbean are at the center of this history. Remember that Haiti became the second independent nation in this hemisphere and chose to abolish slavery as first priority and to build their independence on the basis of democracy. It's important to recognize, therefore, that Haiti and the Caribbean therefore represent the center of Western democracy in action. This is where it first occurred in the Caribbean. So we are very much in the cradle of the Western search for an inclusive humanity. We have every reason to believe that the philosophical tenets of Western civilization are today on trial. You can choose a path in which there is elite domination of resources, of civil society, in which white masculinity is the principal source of power and authority and rightness. Or we can choose an ideology in which democracy, inclusion, equality, social justice, societies for all is the preferential philosophical construct. I believe that the people, the majority of American people, have chosen the former. They have chosen to return to a past. They have rejected a concept of the future. They have put aside a perception of that inclusive democracy. Together we are stronger. That whole view, which is really a metaphor for humanity. It was not just a metaphor for the American discourse. The notion of together we are stronger is a metaphor for humanity on the whole, for the world to recognize that together humanity is stronger. These two philosophies have contended throughout the history of plantation America. We have seen in the Caribbean those philosophies at work in our democracies. The rise of the concept of social justice, the rejection of the concept of social justice, the rise of inclusive democracy, the rejection of inclusive democracy. This is all part of the same conversation. We have had this conversation in all of our Caribbean democracies. What took place yesterday in the United States is just another conversation in another location in our hemisphere. We have seen in Brazil in recent years President Lula calling for an inclusive Brazil, a multiracial Brazil, an inclusive democracy, Brazil for all, multiracial, multicultural, together we are stronger. And we have seen the impeachment of the president because that philosophy has been rejected by a white supremacy elite. The conversation in Brazil over the last 6 months is the identical conversation to the conversation in North America. It is all the conversation of this hemisphere in which we are searching to put a kind of past behind and to imagine a kind of future. There are some important lessons, I believe, to be learned from all of this. I have no doubt that we are going to see a political strategy to imagine North America as the center of a reconstructed white global supremacy system. I believe that in the next year or two, what we're going to witness is a massive migration out of Europe into North America. That foundation has already been laid. And this will be the third phase of such a migration. Remember, it was that first phase that led to the construction of plantation America. Remember that after emancipation in the middle of the 19th century, the black community was on par to become a significant part of the society in terms of demographics. At emancipation, the black community was about 40–50% of the overall population. Remember that there was a massive migration out of Europe that drove the black community from a 50–50 potential into 10% of the population. Millions of Europeans poured into North America after emancipation and created a certain kind of structure. It led, of course, to the Ku Klux Klan. It led to the pushing of black people off their land. It led to the marginalization of the black community, and it led to the rise of white supremacy in phase 2. Phase 3 is going to come, where you will see an even massive majority of migrants coming out of Europe into North America, driving the so-called brown-black alliance even into a smaller minority position. And you will ask yourself, what will be the significance of that? You will also witness, I am sure, a migration of Hispanics out of North America. You will witness the return of many Caribbean citizens out of North America, and we have to prepare ourselves for a return migration. Understand these are going to be the forces that will be unleashed. This is not the first time this has happened. I can assure you I was living in Great Britain when Maggie Thatcher came to power with very similar philosophical constructs. And that was the beginning of a net migration of Caribbean peoples out of Britain. I was one of those who left on a one-way ticket. You're going to witness a return of larger and larger numbers of Caribbean peoples back to the Caribbean and significantly back to Latin America. And in the context of a massive migration out of Europe, Eastern Europe especially, into America, we are witnessing in the next year or two the change in demographics. I believe also that this process is going to have an adverse impact on the global economy. My expectation as an economic historian is that we're going to see the deepening of the world recession. Because 3/4 of humanity will assume that the United States no longer possess a moral authority to direct the world economy. World trade has always been driven by certain kinds of multilateral and bilateral ideologies and philosophies. The assertion of these value systems in the current space will have an adverse impact on global trade. I think in the Caribbean we have to prepare for that. We have to prepare for the consequences of a return to diminished levels of international trade as a result of this construct. It is not just, therefore, a political movement within the narrative of a country. It's the restructuring of global ideologies which will impact upon globalization. And remember the best way to view globalization. globalization has always been a contradictory process. The politics of globalization and the economics of globalization have always gone in different directions. On the one hand, there is the rhetoric of the level playing field of all nations having access. That's the political narrative of globalization. The economics of globalization, however, have demonstrated themselves around the concept of rich nations versus poor nations, strong nationalisms versus weak nationalisms, the solidarity of ethnicities against weaker ethnicities. That has been the fundamental political force of globalization. And what we have seen in North America is that the large, white, working class, unskilled, that have been excluded by globalization because of the rise of technology, have responded to that circumstance through ethnic solidarity. They have responded to their global exclusion through ethnic solidarity. The identical process has happened in Britain. The exact process is happening across Europe. If you place the Brexit and the US circumstance in the same context, you will see that there is a preference for the pass. The majority of citizens are preferring to go back to a pass, a pre-technology pass. And the way to do that is to consolidate around ethnic solidarity. It is not for us in the university to moralize about matters of this nature. It is for us to analyze them and to understand them. I've had an opportunity to be in the US during President Obama's inauguration in 2008. And I was in a pharmacy in Washington, and an elderly white lady came up to me and she said, "Sir, how far have you come from?" I said, "I have come from the next village, the Caribbean." She said, "I've come from California, and I have traveled all of this way because I never thought in my lifetime that I would see morality at the center of power." And in her judgment, that is what Obama represented, morality at the center of power. For her, that moment was phenomenal. And in her language, it was clear that she did not expect it to last. She's not a student of history. But again, we are looking at these processes dialectically. The forces that have produced Obama, the forces that were conceptualized around stronger together, those forces will not go away. They have been defeated. Those ideologies and philosophies will not go away. They have been defeated. But the turn of history and the dialectics of history will see the resurgence of those ideologies in short time, I'm quite sure. So welcome to the university. Welcome to this dialogue. Welcome to this forum. And let us go to work. Thank you. Thank you so much, moderator and panelists. I think we have focused this morning on the question of alignment. And I think this is really the core issue, whether this development in US politics has thrown the relationship between the Caribbean and the US completely off tangent. The question is, how do we effectively analyze if we are out of alignment? Now, bear in mind that the development strategy of most Caribbean countries in the last 30 to 40 years has been to align as closely as possible our development strategies with the US. This is how we have perceived nation building. This is how we have perceived the development of our countries, to come into as close as possible into a compliance, if not an alignment, with the US economy and political discourse. This is what we have done. What we have to wrap our minds around at the moment is whether or not we have been thrown out of this alignment, into this alignment, and what do we do now? If you ask the question, what is the Caribbean? One of the answers will be that the Caribbean is a place where the process of pursuing a democratic sensibility has been galloping and moving aggressively forward. That we have taken this project of democracy very seriously. We do believe that any citizen who is focused and who is organized can become what they want to be. We believe that in the Caribbean. We recognize that there are structural problems in the Caribbean, but we also believe that any citizen with opportunity, with capability, can be given that opportunity. That is the core of our belief system. The question now is whether that fundamental philosophy is now consistent with what Trumpism represents. And we have to be very clear on what is Trumpism. Trumpism isn't just republicanism. The question about the Cuba connection, the Russian connection is important. It is very important. Putin was able to mobilize a political narrative to capture the Russian state, to enable big business to take a transcendent position in the collapse of communism. So with the collapse of communism, Putin was effectively able to mobilize big business to take possession of the state and use the state as a tool to empower that group. Now, it is clear to me that Trumpism and Trump was able to develop a strategy to take possession of the American state. And his purpose of taking possession of the American state is not to implement social transformation, not to use the state for purposes of public democracy and empowerment. The purpose of Trumpism is to capture the state for the empowerment of a group of people who have a perception of what America is. And that is precisely why Trumpism and Putinism are identical. This is precisely why they are both doing the same thing in their respective countries. Take the state away from those who believe that the state's primary responsibility is social engineering, building democracy, public health, community empowerment, equality for women, treating children and women with a certain kind of respect. That view of the state is not included in Trumpism. Now, our concern in the Caribbean is that this points to a major challenge for all of us. The UNDP's report, which was published on the Caribbean just a month ago, made an interesting observation that what is holding back the Caribbean economy is the fundamental inequalities in the Caribbean. This election in America, the primary force is the politics of the excluded and the politics of those who feel that they are not equal citizens. The implications for the Caribbean is very, very clear. We have run democracies in the last 30 to 40 years, and half of our citizens are not fully, effectively yet enjoying the benefits of citizenship. In most of our countries, half of our people are trapped in ghettos. Half of our people are trapped in ghettos outside of health, education opportunities. This is what we have. So we have in the Caribbean a large block of our citizens who are excluded, marginalized, and trapped, and not in a position to make fundamental contributions to their countries. This is what UNDP has said. Trump has tapped into that situation in his country. What he has done, he has said, yes, the technological revolution has marginalized the unskilled And those people without higher education, without technical skills, the march of the economy has excluded anyone without technical skills or higher education. So yes, there are millions of Americans who would go to work in the factories are closed. They work in the steel firms, closed. So yes, there is the Rust Belt, millions of people who generation after generation worked in the same place. My grandfather worked in the steel mill. My father worked in the steel mill. I will go and work in the steel mill. The steel mill is closed. And believe me, there are towns and cities right across that Rust Belt where the economies came to a grinding halt. And I agree, there was no program to accommodate those millions of people whose domestic, regional, and local economies were shattered. Agreed. Now, in the Caribbean context, how are we going to look at that? Or in the cities, right across the Caribbean, or in the cities, we have millions of people who are not in a position to participate in the modern economy. There's diminished public expenditure on education, diminishing public expenditure on public health and community development. So we too are carrying in each of our countries this large pool of excluded people from the economy, from citizenship, waiting for Trumpism to come and take them forward. And we have to understand that this has implications for our democracies and how we are managing our democracies right now. It should not be that 40 to 50 years after our independence, that in any of our islands, half of our people are still ghettoized, excluded from democracy. The question then is, how do we align our economies, as Professor Bonnell has said, with this reality? We have a tourism industry to drive forward. How do we align our tourism industry with the kind of economy that Trumpism represents? How do we align the exportation of our commodities with this Trumpism? How do we align not only our foreign policy, but our domestic economic structures and strategies? Finance, banking, insurance, tourism, the exportation of our manufacturers. How do we align it? If we are ideologically out of alignment, and we are politically out of alignment, how do we align the economy? How do we align the Caribbean economy when it is quite clear that politically and ideologically we are out of alignment with what has happened? This is really the challenge of Caribbean leadership. Unless the argument is that there is a Trumpist group in each of our countries who are consistent with Trumpism. Unless we assume that in each of our Caribbean countries there is a social group, an empowered social group that is in alignment with Trumpism, and there is a Caribbean Trumpism in each of our societies. That is where the analysis, in my judgment, has to take place. That is where the analysis has to take place in terms of the Caribbean economy, Caribbean politics, and Caribbean sociology. The alignment process is where we have to drill down and where we have to go forward. I think we've had a wonderful conversation, and I wish to thank the panelists, and I wish to thank everyone for participating. Moderator, I can assure you, colleagues, that no one is suffering greater division today than I am. My first name is Hilary, and my second name is Donald. So I am, history has played a terrible trick on me. And, you know, every day I say to myself, why has history done this to me? Why has history given me these two names in the middle of this contest? But what we are focusing on, I think, in this second panel are two issues. And I love the way in which they were polarized. There are the issues of ideas, how Mr. Trump was able to connect to a series of ideas within the political space. Ideas about pro-life, ideas about working class marginalization, ideas about big business. And as Wayne has said, he rose up by connecting all of these ideas into a matrix. And that package of ideas that he connected to gave him electoral energy. But there's another level beyond the level that Wayne spoke about. It's the level of character, public decency, humanity, and what persons in public life ought to symbolize. And there are two issues. I do not believe the world would be in this state today if Mr. Trump had won an election on the basis of those ideas. I don't believe there would be any discourse. Okay, so he got the pro-life vote, fine. Those votes have always been there. Fine, he got the evangelical votes, fine. Working class people who feel disconnected from technology, industrial exportation, yes, that is fine. And he would have won all of those points, and no one would have said, oh my Lord, what is happening? It was another level, it was the layer above that of what kind of public leadership are we validating in the modern world? What kind of assault upon our sensitivity, sensibility, our humanity? The violation of the identity of women, it was just so morally repugnant that is where the world revolted. The revolt is not about the ideas. The revolt is not about the pragmatism, because those ideas were held by Republicans and Democrats. Republicans and Democrats had their views about pro-life, about unemployment, about health care. All those views are shared across the political space. It is this layer that has left us feeling tainted in the modern world. And this is where I believe we should never give up. Then there's another issue as well. In all the democracies of the modern world, a fundamental value is that you must speak truth to power. That leadership is about people as citizens speaking truth to power. Those with power, we will speak the truth to them. But what we have seen with Mr. Trump is the speaking of lies to the powerless. So the philosophy is turned upside down. You speak lies daily to the powerless. The powerful speak lies to the powerless every day, and the powerless believe the lies. That is really the issue that is leaving people thinking, how is democracy going to work when the powerful just tell lies every day to the powerless, and the powerless accept those lies as truth? These are the issues that have left the world shaken this morning. It is not whether the pro-life or the unemployment or the health care. Those are not the issues that have left us shaken. Now, we also know that the demonization of Hillary Clinton, it is not the demonization of Hillary Clinton because she is a presidential candidate. It's the demonization of what she represents. That yes, that she is a woman, and that she is a kind of woman. She is an articulate, passionate, committed, long-serving woman. That is what is being demonized, that she has been out there all her life in public service on behalf of the people, and now she has made a claim to provide that leadership at the federal level. And furthermore, that she is a progressive woman, that she is a socialist, and has always been more progressive than her husband and many other people in the party. Those are the issues also that such a woman ought not to be able to lead the nation. And I think it's important to ask who did the demonization, and how and why was that so completely effective. Now, remember the conversation in Alice in Wonderland. Remember the conversation between Alice and Humpty Dumpty. which we all did in primary school, but we should never forget it. If you've forgotten it, go and read it again. Humpty Dumpty says to Alice, "A word means what I want it to mean, no more and no less." And Alice said, "Surely a word must have a meaning that all of us can agree upon." And Humpty Dumpty says, "No, it depends on who is the master. Power," Humpty Dumpty says, "power is the ability to explain reality and force other people to accept your reality as their common sense." And this is really what happened here quite clearly. What are the lessons? What are the lessons for us in the Caribbean? What are the lessons for us? I think lesson number one. Politicians Marvet. Politicians are at their best when they are inspirational. They are at their worst when they are given a monopoly of responsibility. Now, in any society where politics takes the center stage of life, where the only discourse in a society is the political discourse of parties, where the dominant discourse in the society is what the formal politicians are doing and saying. When that political discourse crowds out civil society, all of you who are involved in civil society organizations, your voice is right out. This is a case, I believe, a lesson for us, that all of us in education, all of us in the NGOs, in the women's movements, in the trade union movements, all of us in a range of religious organizations, all of us in a range of civil society movements must allow our voices to become center of the narrative. If you don't fill out that space, the only narrative in your society is what the politicians say. And what they say then becomes what you will respond to every single day. So, academia has to rise up. The Americans, all of my colleagues in academia are now wondering. There are 40,000 universities. How can a society with 40,000 universities and colleges allow this to happen? What happened to the world of the universities? Universities are centers of enlightenment and progressive discourse and keeping the moral compass at the center. You know, how did this incredible matrix of universities and colleges get so easily pushed aside to allow for a language of politics that is so vulgar to win a debate? That is another important issue. Then there is a question of allowing our humanity to be pushed aside by powerful economic interests. The fact that Mr. Trump was able to use the vulgarity of communication in relation to everyone and still win can be explained in terms of the rage by a significant section of the community who felt that his language corresponded with how they felt, right? So that those people who felt marginalized, if you were to ask them, how do you feel to be a citizen of America, they would probably use bad language. So therefore, he used the language that corresponded with how they felt. And therefore, there was a synergy. For the rest of us, there was outrage. For the majority, there was no outrage. But as you have heard, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. And that point has to be recognized. Yes, as we said earlier, the majority of citizens in the nation still believe that humanity is important, that social inclusion is important, that the equality is important, that the rights of women to lead is an important issue, the majority still subscribe to those values that will hold the future together. So, I think it behoves us to demand the legitimacy and the centrality of our humanity in moments like this. It is moments like this that if you are silent, those other forces will run amok. We have heard references to Germany in 1934 and 35. When you analyze the social history of Germany, the vast majority of German people, were decent, honorable, hardworking, family people who were living their lives. But this force was organized around them and upon them that silenced them. And when you read the transcripts of the Nuremberg trials, they all said, we didn't know. We didn't know what was happening down the street. We didn't know that in the building next door, the people were taken out and taken to the gas chambers. We didn't know. The question is, do we believe that? Or were they silenced by a perception that this structure is so powerful that if you speak truth to it, it will crush you? And that is really the issue. How do we as citizens, not only in the Caribbean, but in the world, how do we say that Mr. Trump might have won or did win an election upon the basis of a series of ideas? But the conversation in that democracy, the language that was used, is offensive to our humanity. And we can respect the ideas that gave him the electoral majority. We can respect the ideas. But we found that the characterization of the culture in which we have to live in the world, that world that he has created is not acceptable to us. And we have to say that. If we don't say that, then we become complicit in it. We become complicit in it, and critically, we then normalize it. In other words, Humpty Dumpty wins the conversation. Thank you.